Hello, everyone. Welcome to Munro Live here for our podcast. I'm your host today, Tom Pruchet, Director of Electrification for Munro Associates. And today we have a special guest, Mr. Jordan Giesige of The Limiting Factor. He's here to talk to us about a number of different fun topics, not the least of which is the sort of quasi-collaboration we had with the 4680 cell that he tore down and reported on in great detail. Thank you for that, Jordan. We should just
Thank you. That was like those cells aren't easy to get a hold of, and I know you guys. There's a lot of work you put into tearing those cells out of the packs, so it's of benefit to the entire Tesla community. It's really useful and interesting information that we pull out of that. So thank you. Yeah.
All right, and I did watch your videos. Found it to be very comprehensive and detailed, and really something the nerds will thrive on. So if the viewers here haven't seen it, they should watch those. But, there are some interesting things. Number one, the mystery about the voltage. The first cells we extracted, we discharged them before they came out. This was because it was sort of a unknown, uncharted water with regard to the safety, and we knew what we had up against us here. So we just said, as we're practicing the extraction of live cells, let's do it on dead ones. So yeah, after it gets to 0 volts and you release it to the wild, it grows up magically to 0.44 in your case. But yeah, that's a natural phenomenon of these cells. But it's also a well-known subject that batteries don't like to be in that state. They get kind of angry and they tend to leak when they're like that. So it was a good thing that you tore it down quickly, probably, because it may not have kept its integrity over the long haul otherwise. But I thought I'd solve that mystery for those who had the question in their mind. Let's tear right into this. All the hype about the dry cathode, and then it wasn't there. Now we think it's there. We know that there's at least one truck with it now, right? I would hope that by now there's a whole fleet that are deep durability testing. What do you know?
Well, I know as much as you at this point, which is that they have one truck that uses those dry cells, the fully dry cells, both the cathode and the anode. So, as a refresher for people, in the past they were doing the dry anode, but they were importing wet coated cathode material. And the rumor was that was from Asia, which that makes perfect sense. They have a lot of production capacity there.
Okay.
Uh, so we're hoping that they had finally moved away from that, and they've confirmed at least with one truck that they have. But uh, their advice last quarter was that they plan on starting to ramp that this quarter. They didn't give any more details besides that, but I'm expecting they're early in the production ramp. And there's been rumors by, I think it's Steve Levine of The Information, who reported that he has contacts there, and they're saying, yes, it's still very early in the production ramp, and they want to get that production ramp going by, at a good pace at volume production by the middle of next year from memory. So it's coming. And what surprised me is nobody asked about this at the last Tesla earnings calls. A lot of the questions at the last Tesla earnings call were kind of weak from the um, retail investor side. But that's something I hope somebody asks about next quarter, so we should, it's nice to have updates on that every quarter because there's developments every quarter. But yeah, I wouldn't expect a lot of vehicles to have those cells until the middle of next year, if everything I'm hearing is correct or we're hearing is correct.
Okay, and just for further background for the subscribers, yeah, this is a cost savings thing more than anything. It eliminates the process of having to extract the solvents that are normally part of a slurry methodology, and they successfully did that on the anode back on the Gen 1 cell, and we were all hoping, knocking wood, that they'd make it on this one, and they haven't made it yet, to Jordan's point. So that's an interesting subject all by itself, and Tesla acquired a capacitor company, if we all recall correctly, to hope to extract this dry methodology, and I guess that worked, at least for the anode. So, okay, so now we know that it's coming, And when it happens, it should represent a cost reduction, and maybe that will enable the lowering of the price of the vehicles that will use those. So now all of that is, kind of focused on Tesla. We also know that this 4680 cell has legs. It's now a big interest of a lot of the battery manufacturers. Several of them have announced plans of not just 4680s, but longer lengths as well. So it's going to be interesting to see if any of those kind of catch up and maybe surpass Tesla's progress. Could be the case. Any insights on that? Any of that activity?
I think it's going to take a while because a lot of these companies are claiming to have cracked the dry electrode, and they're still at the pilot phase. And well, if we remember back, Tesla had thought they cracked it 5 years ago, but it took them this long to work from pilot to scale production. Now, the benefit they have is a lot of the equipment suppliers that Tesla uses, or the equipment suppliers that Tesla uses, they've been learning things along with Tesla. And so hopefully the learnings that Tesla has gained with those third parties, other people can buy that equipment and they won't have so many stumbling blocks along the way. But it really depends on, we don't exactly know what kind of equipment um, those other companies are using. So there's no way to verify that. But industries look, they learn together. There's places within an industry where people learn things, and that kind of diffuses out, and a rising tide lifts all boats. So I do think it's coming. I think eventually everybody's going to use a dry electrode process if Tesla can fully crack it. It's looking very promising at the moment. It looks like they've cracked it. But yeah, after it's been confirmed and it gets on the market, then I think everybody's going to follow suit. I think it's just a matter of time. But I do think they're not going to hit scale with dry electrode batteries for another 2 to 3 years. Anybody outside of Tesla, if you just look at a plain 4680 with a wet coating, there's not very many of those on the. There's a lot of different brands that have tackled that, but not at very high volume, like LG Chem and Panasonic. They're still working on it, trying to get their 4680 lines up and running. And that was without any major changes to the cell. It's just a bigger cell, and it's taken them. Tesla has rolled out their 4680 faster than they've done just a larger battery cell, and Tesla's introduced a lot of innovations.
Well, let's support your hypothesis here a little bit by saying we can all agree that Tesla is rather quick to market with some of their stuff. That's one of the things that's caught all the other automakers off guard. How did they do that? They denied every other aspect of that until it was undeniable. And
Well, and it's interesting because people are frustrated by the speed of the 4680 ramp. But if you look at in the context of the rest of the battery industry, they've a lot of new battery factories, they take about 5 years to get that plant up to high yield rates. Tesla, this is the first time they've ever produced a battery cell, and they're introducing a lot of new technology to that. And if we look at more context, is been a lot of startups that have gone bankrupt in the past couple of years that looked promising, but almost none of them are succeeding. So,
more evidence of that is just look at the differences between the Gen 1 and the Gen 2. Would other companies have been able to do it that quickly? Most of them would still be, hair on fire trying to validate it and, still be stuck on the first generation for maybe another year or two. So, kudos to Tesla for bringing to the market quickly and managing that without calamity. And that kind of brings us to Calamity.
okay.
They brought us a new, much thinner can. And in your videos, there was a little bit of confusion about that. But you, right away at the beginning, pointed out that the deep draw causes sort of some thickness issues. And if you're not comparing like for like, it can be very confusing. So you found in your second iteration it to be quite a bit closer to your prediction on thickness, and a much better explanation of the increase in energy density that you found, and specifically gravimetric energy density. So volumetrically, maybe not quite the difference that you saw gravimetrically, and this is by weight versus by volume for those who need to know. So, that structural integrity is now kind of called into question. It's got a number of different attributes to it. It's not just the thickness of the metal, it's the welding methodologies. There's this rumor that's out there that was reported in a couple of different news channels about what was sort of a recall on these things of the early ones. And I don't know if you know anything about this, sorry to blindside you with it, but collapsing on themselves. Did you read that part?
I didn't hear anything about cells collapsing on themselves.
Yeah, there's no detail about what that means either. It was in Green Car Reports and a few other places. So,
Oh, is this okay, now is this something we're talking about from a year or 2 ago, or is this talking about, rumors related to the ramp of the fully dry cell, which isn't really on the market yet?
this was cells that are being recalled from the February manufacturing timeframe.
Interesting. Okay, now is this an internal collapse, like, for instance, the, electrode delaminating from, like, the electrode within the cell, or is this like a can crumpling or something like
Ah, now I know that asking you was the wrong idea here because I know less than you do. But anyway, when you look at the cell, and I got a couple of them in my hand here in bags, yeah, it's different. And I'd like to dive into that.
I have a couple of the actual just the cell cans with no material in it, and it's like one is so flexible and the other one, it feels like you could build a house out of it. So, like, the first one was so robust, felt like overkill. But I can understand why they picked that cell can thickness because, it increased in proportion to the cell diameter from the 2170 to the 4680. So they made that cell can a lot thicker to maintain the same hoop stress at a larger diameter.
Yeah, there was a lot of controversy with the Gen 1 cell, whether it actually took on any of the structural loads of the structural pack. And when you look at the way it was constructed, they didn't have the same sort of longitudinal ribbing and a number of other aspects. So, without doing any real mechanical analysis, the Cybertruck pack just looks a lot more robust with regard to, being contorted and applying any sort of force on the cells. So I think they took some license there to take away some of the structural integrity of the cell because it didn't need it in the Gen 2. So that's my theory or hypothesis, and I will go with that
Do you
for now.
think I have questions about that for you. So the Cybertruck pack, do you think they overbuilt that because it was a truck? Because there was a good energy density increase between the Model Y 4680 pack and the Cybertruck 4680 pack, but it wasn't as much as I was expecting, for instance. And I was wondering if that's because they build in a little bit more safety margin in something that was going to be off-roading and made it a little bit more robust.
Oh, we could talk about that for the rest of this hour here. But yeah, they did a number of things in the pack design that made it sort of truck-worthy, if you will.
Oh, okay.
Not the least of which is my favorite, water fording mode, so that it turns on the compressed air channel to pressurize the battery pack so you can go in water. But there's a huge sort of a buffer zone underneath it that made it have a lot of empty volume. And people looked at that and said, ooh, they're getting prepared for the 46120 and it'll fit right in there. And no, I wouldn't be counting on that because this thing has to go over rocks and stumps and all sorts of different road hazards that you want to have that space to protect it with. Plus, you have to have a sort of an evacuation space for the gases to get out in the event of any sort of gas release or thermal runaway event. So yeah, I think that they did do that, but I think they were judicious about it. And again, where they increased the structure of the pack, they might have removed some from the cell, and it was all in good balance, I think, in my view at least. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Oh, absolutely it does. And following up from that, sorry, this is turning into an interview of you by me. Um, so, do you see, from Gen 1 to Gen 2, you said they kinda changed the balance between the pack and the cell in terms of, like, where they, put the structure, and they're kind of iterating as they go. Uh, when you tore down that Cybertruck pack, did you think to yourself at any point, "Hmm, there's a few places here where, they could probably strip out a weight or make this more efficient?" Do you see a continued glide path down to, cutting a bit more weight out of that pack and making it, higher energy density and cheaper over time? Or do you think they've bottomed out at this point?
Oh, it's hard to say. The one thing about Tesla is that they're always improving. I like to show the evolutionary path of the S and X modules through the years. And it was pretty amazing, the transformation that pack went through. And on the outside, it all kind of looked the same to everybody. So, yeah, I would say for sure you're only looking at the tip of the iceberg and what they can do with this pack design. And I don't want to sound like a Tesla fanboy because I am so not one of those. But it's very clear by their continuous evolution that they're not done with this one. It's going to get better, and it won't be just the cell improving. It will be packaging related as well. That seems certain to me. But I'll tell you what they did do with that thing is they made it really hard to take apart. So try to imagine that we did extract, I forget how many live cells we got, 5 or 6 of them, but we must have pulled 20 that weren't so good when we pulled them out. But the idea of pulling out a live cell that's still got a charge on it is a little bit intimidating when both of the electrodes are on the far side of your view, buried in polyurethane foam. Unlike the Model Y, where you could peel away and get those electrodes, and here's a pair of pliers, let's peel those off. Oh, now that cell is not electrically connected to anything. You can pull it right out of there with impunity. So yeah, they made it real difficult, and I don't see that going away anytime soon. I fully expected that if we'd have torn the pack apart further, we'd have found some note at the bottom saying, "Hi, Sandy," like we had with some other little Easter eggs we found in the truck. But anyway, we didn't get that far. We only got as far as we needed to get through the testing because it was just monumentally difficult and dangerous. So, but we're past that. So thank you for asking. All right, on to something different yet. So the welds. I noticed in your video, you show a lot of early images of the second gen cell with the laser weld on the anode end, right? And in the cell that you received, it looked a little bit like this. And I'll give these to Grace so she can do sort of a close-up for the viewers here. But the one that you had what I would call the 9-weld version. So there's 2 in a sort of a triangular arrangement with a kind of a Mercedes sign going out from there for the 3 additional welds. So that's 6 and 3 for 9 in total. Yet in that pack, it was probably a 50-50 mix between 9 welds and 12 welds.
Yeah.
And the one you show had only 3. And it was in a different shape. So I'm speaking out loud, wondering if this isn't some sort of a dynamic part of their assembly process where they try it with 9 welds, and if it meets their criteria for probably resistance, then they leave it. And if it fails, then okay, let's put 3 more on it. And maybe that's how you get from 9 to 12. Any insights how this has evolved? I mean, it went from 3 to 9 to 12, and the pack we had was kind of commingled between 9s and 12s.
Wild speculation on my part because I don't know what's going on there, and it was shocking for me to see that. What I think they did is they took the most safe approach first, and they're like, okay, let's make maybe you just got lucky. Maybe there was sort of a transitioning period where they're moving from one number of welds to another number of welds, and you just got that pack. But either way, I see it as okay. We'll start with this many welds, and then we'll try to reduce it and see how that affects the resistance over time. The fewer the welds, maybe the faster that you can produce these cells. Let's get the production rate up, but we also have to take into account safety. So moving as fast as you can while also being safe. Which, oh god, that's a whole cultural discussion about the way companies think about these things. But yeah, some company cultures like move fast and break things, and you don't have to worry about safety. Other ones are too conservative. But it's if you can hit that sweet spot between a company culture that's let's move as fast as we can while being safe, that's great. And so far, Tesla's been succeeding with the 4680 packs. But it surprised me that they would mix those different types of cells in the packs. Did you notice any specific pattern as to how those were placed, or was it completely random where those multiple different numbers of welds were placed within that pack?
I would say it was perfectly random.
Okay.
And almost evenly distributed. from the ones we got to look at, right?
Okay.
So it's new and different. It's part of the Gen 2 cell design. They got rid of the collector plate at the bottom. They welded the tabs directly to the can. When you pull that end of the can off and you look at it and you see kind of it grabs some of the copper and pulls it with it. And then you look really closely and you go, wow, those welds missed the copper in a lot of places. So then I started thinking, okay, maybe that's where you got the 3 additional welds. But how did they know to do that? Maybe it's part of a intermediate test. That was my hypothesis of that particular one. But I
Oh, so
just,
you think it's the reverse. You think they might be increasing the welds, because they didn't get enough contact.
and to your point, these things should be electrically matched to each other, right? You would expect I'd get all 9s or all 12s, right? But if it's indeed to match like a target or an ideal, then that would explain the commingling in my view. So
So do you think as long as they meet a minimum, um, like, I don't know, ohmic threshold or whatever it is in terms of resistance, that they would just put those cells in the pack? Um,
I think that would give them a good vote of confidence that the cell impedance would be what it's supposed to be at the final test.
all right. But I would imagine if all those cells had like a slightly different impedance, that it would dick around with the, sorry, mess around with the BMS and it might have some issues there.
Well, the vast majority of the resistance that represents that impedance is, part of the chemistry, right? And you want to expect that the welds are just a minimal contribution to that. So if you overweld it, it should only have a really minute effect on the total impedance. However, have too few, and now you got a problem. And in fact, when we tested the first cell, the Gen 1 cell, it had that gasket at the bottom. And it was easy to make the error of thinking, oh, I'll just connect the positive electrode on this side and the negative one on that side, and hey, there's voltage there. Look at that. Let's test it. Oh, it seems to work, and then let's pull some power of it, and it dies. So yeah, you can't pull power out of the bottom of the can of that thing because it's not a solid electrical connection. But not unlike your 12-volt battery in your car with a loose terminal on it, I turn my headlights on, it looks like it's working, but if I crank the engine, it dies like a rock because it opens up in a dynamic sort of way if you've got, some questionable resistance that's high enough to get to most of your targets, but not high enough for the peak load. So again, I think that's just belt and suspenders for them, or call it belt and braces for those watching from international communities.
How much time do you have?
We have about another half an hour, maybe
Okay.
35 minutes.
Okay, because I don't want to mess up your flow of questions, but I like, well, you're saying things that it's triggering thoughts on my end. Like I didn't, we couldn't test the resistance because it was a fully discharged cell. So that was one thing I was curious about. Are you able to share, or did you check the resistance of the Gen 2 versus Gen 1 cell? I don't want you stepping into things that might be giving away the game from your report, but I was curious.
To be truthful, I was somewhat abstracted from the generation of the report, so it's not fresh in my memory. But it would surprise me if we went into that sort of detail. I could be wrong. That being the case, that's one of the things we're doing here at Munro. We're trying to go from benchmarking and costing to adding some value and analyzing the performance of these systems. It's a whole lot more interesting to talk about than the material construction. How many pennies does it cost to make this little dime tab on the end of the cell? It's kind of boring. So that was one of the things that brought me to Munro, was the hope of expanding that functionality here. And I've made an impact, but it's now got a life of its own. And yeah, in that particular report case, I got pulled out once I successfully extracted the live cells we needed to do the test. So sorry for the non-answer there, but
They're keeping you busy, in short.
well, that's just it. I'm looking to you for all my insights here because I'm busy on projects up to my head.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
that
I
being,
feel good.
yeah.
Um, Looking at what Tesla, circling back around to put a bow on what we were talking about with the different versions of the welds on the cells, to me, this gives me the impression that they have an extraordinary amount of confidence in what their requirements are and how the entire system works. Because that's, from my perspective, it's kind of bold. If you were didn't have a lot of confidence in your understanding of how that pack comes together and what the requirements are, uh, you'd probably shy away from using different versions of the same cell within a pack. So, um, yeah, I found it impressive that they were able to do that.
All right. Well, good stuff here. Oh, the performance and characteristics. All over the map and trying to figure out what the energy density was on these things. You had a couple of different goes at it. The numbers don't all line up, but it's directionally correct. They improved the energy density. It's quite clear. Your second analysis seems to show that they've surpassed the energy density of the 2170 benchmark before it. So, okay, good for them. I was wondering whether that would be borne out in iteration, and you gave us a couple of additional iterations, so thank you. So, but at the same time, you also in your video go into, third, fourth, and fifth generations and made some speculation on when we might see some of that stuff. So, when you look at that evolution and you think, well, this must be the thing we've been waiting for. 46 millimeters is the magic diameter. But the reality is that the radius there is really, really long. And if you're trying to extract heat out of the center of the cell, this 46 millimeters can be a problematic thing, right? Because you have to go longitudinally down the foils to basically move the heat to the ends and then extract it there. Whereas these smaller cells, 18650s, have come to mind, like is the king of the hill power performance of the Plaid. Yeah, they have a nice short radius, a 9 millimeter range they've got to get to. So what I'm getting at is, do you really think this is going to be the form factor of the future, given that it's sort of power handicapped in extracting heat from the center versus what we're seeing now with all these other chemistries that are coming? It's a real mix and match of different stuff that's out there. So, just wanted to get your insight on that. Is this the form factor that we should be betting the farm on, or are we going to see some other ones that give it a good run for its money?
I do believe it is the correct form factor. And that's because, like, right now, they're currently using that battery cell in the highest performance use cases, or some of the highest performance use cases, like the uh, foundation of, or the what's it called?
The
The,
Foundation Series
well,
Cybertruck,
it's the
the
foundation
the
series, but
Beast, the Cyber
yeah,
Beast.
Cyber Beast, and it can go 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds, and the cell has plenty of power for that.
Now, my comparison is the total horsepower that makes it out to the road, if you want to use that analogy. The Plaid is still king of the hill at 1,020 horsepower.
Yeah.
So for whatever reason, that's still an 18650 cell. And my hypothesis, again, is the smaller diameter gives you a larger amount of metal space to extract heat from with a shorter distance for it to travel to be able to extract that heat. So that's the handicap I see with this big diameter. It makes me wonder.
I agree. Now, the reason why I was bringing up the cyber that the Cybertruck that can go 0 to 60 in 2.5 seconds is all the other use cases that they're going to have for this cell are going to have lower power requirements. So if it can supply enough power for that vehicle, then it's going to meet the use case for the bulk of situations. And that's what this cell was designed for, is uh, uh, to be able to be used in the most number of use cases and in the bulk of use cases, like the robotaxi. The robotaxi isn't going to need a huge amount of power. The Model 3 and the Model Y, they're not going to need as much power in most instances. But I do believe they still will keep the 18650 and 2170 cells there, um, for those ultra high performance use cases, such as the what do we have coming up? The Roadster and the Plaid Model S. I don't think the Semi needs a battery with that much power because it makes up for that by having such an enormous pack.
No, it's energy always is your friend when you're looking for power.
Yeah. So overall, I believe you're right that I don't think the 4680 is going to be as performant in terms of power, but it's going to be a cheaper cell to produce at higher volumes. It's for the bulk of the market.
All right, I love that. That actually matches my hypothesis quite well, because that's kind of what I see this to be. This is a cost-saving maneuver that is critically important to the future of electrification of automobiles because we can't have it cost so much going forward. We're going to finally bring in these applications where people aren't buying it for, 0 to 60 in 3 seconds or less. They actually just have to go somewhere. So for those applications, that will be the vast majority of the vehicles that end up on the road. Yeah, this is going to be a good sell for that, I think. So, all right, we match. All right, going on. Thermal performance. Okay. If you've watched Peter Rawlinson's video, CEO of Lucid, about his 2170 cells where he does bottom cooling versus side cooling, they cool from the bottom. He makes a pretty compelling argument for why cooling from the bottom is better, but I just take a look at the Gen 1 and the Gen 2 cell of the 4680, and I see that we had this disc at the bottom of the Gen 1 with a gasket around it, and we've got this, this solid can now where the anode foils are directly welded to the can, which gives it a more direct path for the heat to follow down the cell longitudinally and be extracted from the bottom. Yet, the Gen 1 had this disc that kind of thermally isolated the bottom, and it made sense when you looked at the side cooling of the Model Y that you could easily say, okay, that's why there isn't much cooling to be had at the bottom because you're not really connected to much down there. It's more of a vent function than anything else. Yet, the 4680 Gen 2, it has a direct path to extract it, yet they're still doing the side cooling. So do you see Tesla moving? Do you see them going away from their serpentine cooler and adopting the bottom cooling method now that they have a cell concept that looks very conducive to that?
I think they're going to stick with the ribbon cooling. I'm digging deep into my memory banks here, but I covered a research paper, I think, a couple of years ago on the topic, and what they found was that the side cooling works well. I think it even worked better overall than the base cooling, because the assumption, at least as I understand it, amongst a lot of people, was like that end cooling or that tab cooling was better. However, it depends on what type of cell you're using it for. Like whether you use side cooling or end or tab cooling, which is most performant depends on which type of cell you're actually using. And I think they found with cylindrical cells that it works just as well, if not better, to cool the side. And some of that, because of that thick cell can, some of that heat energy gets wicked away out of the bottom. Whereas with uh, a pouch cell, the tab cooling worked better from memory. So yeah, I think they're going to stick with it.
Yeah, when you look at it to begin with, it seems really obvious. I mean, I don't know if it shows on camera here, but here's this little patch that's on the surface of the cell. You can see the angular range of surface area that it covers on the cell. And if you just did a rather crude measurement of length and width of that patch and compared it to how much less you have down here, it's obvious. I've got a lot more surface area to extract the heat from. So that being the case, that's completely without regard to where the heat is best extracted. So, my hypothesis in this case here is that now that the foils are all welded directly to the bottom and they don't have that little disc there kind of isolating it from the bottom, then now at least they have a cell design that's well suited for bottom cooling. It's a question to me whether they need it. Those vast majority of the applications we just talked about, they're not going to need it. But could they push this cell higher in performance by doing so? We talked about this large radius. That's a long distance for the heat to travel out to the side, right? And it's a much more quick path down the length because that's where the foils go. I've got aluminum going in one direction and copper in the other. The copper is better than the aluminum, so pull it out of the side that's got copper on it. That makes sense to me. However, it to me would be one of these things where they're going to need the added cooling performance on a shorter term interval, meaning like on a Model S Plaid, you're pulling heat out of the cell during your 0 to 60 run, and it's critically important that you do that. Whereas a lot of cells we see, especially in pouches, There is absolutely no intent to try to extract heat out in real time. It's a kind of thing where, oh, the cell got hot and let's take our time to cool it back down again, and we'll limit the performance of the vehicle while we're waiting. So again, the higher the performance of the vehicle, the more you're going to have emphasis on cooling. And the better the cooling, the better ability you have to extract the heat out faster. And so I was just looking at that, and you think this is the new way? Okay, well, I'll leave it as a prediction that we'll see some changes in the way they cool if and when they ever try to get more power performance out of the cell. They may not, to your point. If you're right, they keep the 2170s and the 18650s, they won't need to do that.
Yeah, there's a lot of variables here.
There is.
There's a lot of options. So, no, I can appreciate that point.
Well,
I would have to chew on that one a little bit more and think about all
right. I didn't mean to blindside you with that one,
No,
but
that's cool.
I'm really enjoying the back and forth with this and the
Oh, I
spontaneity
enjoy
of it. All
I
right.
enjoy it too. Yeah.
All right. So, estimated cost reductions. Oh boy, how far they can go. We've already seen this huge change in the cost reduction. You mentioned your Gen 3, 4, 5 cells. Do you see cost reduction as part of that plan for the cell itself, or is it just simply, energy improvement?
I think that fundamentally, when you increase the energy density of the cell, if you're using similar materials, you're basic. When you increase the energy density of a cell, you're stripping out everything that isn't lithium. You're stripping out all these um, extra material that shouldn't be in the cell. So fundamentally, the most ideal lithium-ion battery would just be lithium, if you could. But yeah, so everything else is dead weight. So when you remove dead weight from the cell to increase the energy density, you should be automatically reducing the cost at the same time.
This is absolutely true when you think of it at the pack level. You're trying to achieve a certain number of kilowatt hours. Now I have more energy per cell. I theoretically need fewer cells, and there's a huge cost reduction right there. So I was just thinking more of the construction of the can. You've seen a couple of them torn apart. You've seen the evolution between them. It's quite obvious that it's less expensive to make the new one. How far can they go? I was just wondering if you had some sort of insight.
The whole cost thing is like this is a whole playground we can get involved with here because there's one aspect is increasing the energy density, like I've talked to additional generations. I don't think they're going to make many more structural changes to the pack, but I don't know like we're blind here because we don't. You have to take the cell in context of the pack. In order to understand what they're going to do with the cell, you have to also understand what they're going to do with the pack because we're getting so advanced with these technologies that the pack is part of the vehicle structure and the cell is part of the pack structure. So you have to know what's going on with those two other things to understand where the cost is being removed. It's a really complex system. So I have a feeling, this is just my gut feel, that they're approaching the final version of the 4680 cell in terms of its overall physical design. But what I think they're going to do in the future is change the chemistry of those battery cells. And most of their cost reductions that I see happening in the next 2 years is just from scaling that up. They're at such a low scale right now that these battery cells are just now reaching cost parity with third-party alternatives, and that's with that $35 government tax credit. So they need to scale this up. They need to get the dry cathode working, and just those two things, that's going to knock, I don't know, $30 to $45 off the cost of the battery cell. Just get spooling up those lines.
Very
But
nice.
and then the other cost savings measures is the rest of the ecosystem. Like they're vertically integrating into the cathode and lithium production. So that's just a taster platter of all the different ways that they can reduce the cell cost. But I think they're in a pretty good spot in terms of the overall design.
Well, let me just say, if there's anybody from Tesla listening to this podcast, I kind of hope they add a little cost back so that this little tab isn't so damn frail. I'm sorry. We had a lot of problem with that. It falls off really easily. And when I say that, I mean it slightly pulls away from the cell, and then you get electrolyte leaking out of it. And yeah, not a good situation. And this is something the second generation cell is far more prone to. Now that could be the way it's packaged. It's stuffed down into the urethane and we got to pluck it out of there. So we traumatize that little dime-shaped tab at the positive end. And we didn't have to do that so much on the Model Y. So again, please Tesla, add some cost back to it so it's easier to take your stuff apart. I'm sure they're going to do that. Anyway, so chemistries. Wow. We've been working on all these different NMC, NCM chemistries. And they keep iterating. We went from 811, to 955, and we got another one coming. So yeah, it's nice to keep iterating and reduce the cobalt. We don't like high cobalt content. We still kind of need it, but it's also like, the new age blood diamond. So we don't want to have more than that one than we absolutely have to. But there's a lot of chemistries that are coming that won't have any cobalt, and that will be, I think, compelling. But do you see Tesla sticking with this chemistry for the next few years, or will they be bringing in something new?
I see them rolling after they get this ramped. I think uh, taking one thing at a time, and this has been my prediction as we've moved along with this ramp and as I've been covering it, is that they're going to try to do one thing at a time. And I've been surprised when they've tackled more than one thing at once. Like this, there was more innovation packed into this cell from Gen 1 to Gen 2 than I actually expected. Uh, because I figured they do improve the cathode, then they would thin out the cell can or whatever order you prefer, but just one thing at a time. But they did a couple things with this cell. But I think after they get the dry battery electrode problem solved and they can actually get these lines ramping, I think that's when they're going to start playing around with those chemistries. So we could be looking at the end of next year where they feel comfortable. They have a little bit of brain space where they can play around with that. And that matches rumors or reports from Steve Levine of the information where he's saying that they plan on rolling out uh, something like 3 new chemistries, 4 new cells overall, but 3 new chemistries in by 2026 or in 2026. So I think we need something that has a much higher nickel content, more of like a workhorse cell. Nickel, sorry, yeah. Did I say much higher nickel content?
Yes, you did.
Okay. Okay, so with they are gonna do, I think, a higher nickel content cell,
Which
but
they
I was
did
gonna
already with the Gen 1 to
yeah.
Gen 2.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so I think they're gonna keep working on removing that cobalt and making that nickel cell higher performance. So that's the higher performance cell, but I think they also need, an iron-based, an LFP-based cell, like a workhorse cell, and there's a number of different ways they could do that. For example, today there was a patent that came out, a patent I haven't looked into it yet, I'm not sure if it's a patent or a patent application, but what they're looking at playing around with doing is adding a little bit of NMC or nickel oxide cathode doped into the LFP. So you get a little bit of that boost from like the high nickel cathode, but it's still primarily an LFP battery cell. So they could do that. They could add a little bit of manganese doping to improve that LFP. But my base assumption is the workhorse cell, the cheaper cell that's going to be used for the bulk of applications, it's going to be LFP based.
Okay,
It'd be
interesting.
gr and then I think beyond that, between the high nickel and the LFP cell, there's gonna be something that contains a certain amount of, um, manganese. That could be, uh, a nickel oxide cell with a lot of manganese or an iron-based cell with a lot of manganese, something that just kind of bridges the gap in between there.
And it's nice because manganese is not one of the materials that we're very worried about. It's more plentiful and less costly. And yes, we should use more of it if we can.
Yeah.
Nickel and cobalt, yeah, they're kind of the opposite. So, but, it kind of is an important viewpoint that you give me because it makes, prior to hearing your view, it was making me wonder if LFP was even the right way, given the advances in sodium ion that's been coming. As we're making them in scale here in Michigan, in fact, and there's in the news all the time, and then there's the solid state variants of that, and the prospect of not having to use lithium metal in a solid state variation. And yeah, anyway, so you've considered that in your thought with the LFP, right?
In terms of a sodium-based chemistry, I love like the idea of sodium-ion batteries. I love it, but I just don't think they're there yet for a mobile use case. In terms of energy storage, grid storage, and things like that, I think sodium-ion, the energy density is there, and it's certainly being commercialized. Now, for mobility use cases, I don't think the energy density is quite there yet, unless you're planning on giving the robotaxi only like a 150-mile range or something like that with a 4680 cell. Now, in the deeper future, I like the idea of sodium solid state a lot better than lithium solid state, because one of the issues with solid state lithium ion batteries is they use more lithium because of that solid state separator. It doesn't just use a plastic separator. There has to be like a lithium bridge between the cathode and anode, and that has to be kind of saturated with lithium, which makes the separator in a solid state battery a lot more expensive. But if you're using sodium ion, sodium is cheap, so cheap, and it's so abundant. America has the biggest reserves of soda ash in the world by orders of magnitude. So it's the perfect chemistry for the United States. It's if we can solve the sodium solid state batteries, you'll have a high energy density battery, something comparable to what like a 2170 cell is today, except it'll be much cheaper.
I will argue much safer as well.
Okay.
I get fixated on this. I had the honor to meet Dr. Shirley Meng, and we had a
Oh, great.
quick talk on that subject. And, the quick question was, with these solid state chemistries that we read most about, they trade lithium ions for lithium metal. And yeah, while it's probably not such a great idea to take a flammable liquid and surround your volatile metals with it, yeah, that's kind of what we do today. Have you ever seen lithium burn the actual metal? That's really spectacular. Just take a lithium ion battery cell and a lithium metal cell like you have with Eveready Ultimate. And yeah, there's a difference in the spectacularness of the fire. And if you don't believe me, watch the YouTube videos. Don't do it yourself. But they're out there. So yeah, she agreed. Yeah, we do not want a metal anode. We want either an anode-free system or silicon. So, okay. I had it confirmed that you're kind of trading one safety problem for another one with the solid-state chemistries that have lithium metal in the anode. So anyway, I share your enthusiasm about sodium, and I really look forward to them improving it such that we finally have a solid-state version. We'll probably finally get the energy density up where it could compete against some of the other ones. And then, when safety's a factor, then it's going to be the standout in my view. But we've got a long ways to go to get there. Think about how long it took for lithium ion to get to where it is today.
Yeah, and that's one of I had a conversation with Shirley as well about this earlier in the year. She's kind of like one of the go-to people if you want to talk about sodium-ion batteries. This is something she's passionate about. But earlier this year, she said one of the things that uh, is slowing down the adoption of sodium-ion very recently is the fact that the price of lithium-ion batteries has dropped so rapidly. There's a lot more interest in sodium-ion batteries a couple of years ago when lithium prices were through the roof. So but overall, sodium ion batteries at a first principles level are going to be cheaper to produce. So my view is in the long run, whether that's 5, 10, 15 years from now, eventually the sodium ion batteries will dominate because they're fundamentally cheaper. And they can piggyback or borrow technologies from lithium ion to leverage itself into the market.
Yeah, that's good. And I hope that this slow, arduous process that we watched for tens of years with the lithium ion, that gets shortcutted by the knowledge learned from that cycle, right? Sodium ion shouldn't take nearly as long, but it'll still probably go through a similar number of steps, and it's still probably a few years away before we get excited about it for our next car we might want to buy. Although there are some cars being made right now with sodium ion battery cells in it. So, okay, watch that space. All right, I got another topic. a lot of we're going to get away from chemistries. We're going to get away from Tesla even further. A lot of the adoption that we've had on electric vehicles over the last few years, especially, it's been kind of inspired by the Inflation Reduction Act, where we've got these huge tax incentives the user has right from the federal government, and it's arguably sold a lot of cars. Some of the car companies like Tesla have sold enough where they're no longer eligible for those tax credits. So with our new president in place, we're going to have some changes. I think there's going to be some changes to the Biden policies, and good or bad, they're changes. And the battery industry and the electric vehicle industry at large all probably should reconsider their roadmap plans. What's going to change if they either repeal it or, sort of water it down a bit where these tax incentives go away. It'll go back to what the proponents of that idea have in mind is, let the free market decide who the winners are. And, there's a fair argument for that. But at the same time, if you want to save the planet and get the early adopters and then all the others who aren't early right after them, you've got to incentivize them. So what are your thoughts? What's going to happen? Are we going to see something change there? And is it going to be a big impact on our roadmap to electrification?
Okay, there's a lot of competing thoughts that I have about this. So it's in terms of how do you balance all this out? The free market aspect and the government support, and what aspects of these tax credits are we looking at? So, in my view, the Inflation Reduction Act was primarily geopolitical. And I talked to people who were deeply involved in creating that legislation last year or the year before. And they confirmed to me that, yes, there is an environmental aspect to it. It's probably reason number two for the Inflation Reduction Act. The number one reason for the Inflation Reduction Act is the threat of Chinese monopoly power on the battery market, these next generation energy technologies. We have to make sure that it's a national security issue. We can't be something as fundamental as energy. We can't be outsourcing that to China. So a lot of these incentives for the Inflation Reduction Act are for the U.S. to build its own battery supply chain. So I think that's going to be safe. I don't think Congress or the president is going to make any changes to the supply chain aspect of it. That's particularly because a lot of these factories are being built in red states. So people, they're not going to want to pull that money out and go, oh, no, sorry, that factory's canceled, that factory's canceled. That's not a good look for politicians. They don't like upsetting their base. They're, the party is green, whichever party it is.
That's true.
Cash matters, money speaks. So now, however, on the customer facing end, I do expect them to repeal or remove those $7,500 tax credits. Now, that's going to be, I think everybody, all the auto companies are going to suffer for that. But I think it's going to affect Tesla the least because they're actually a profitable company. However, at the same time that those $7,500 tax credits are being removed, Tesla is moving to cheaper vehicles. I don't know whether that's just by chance or they kind of expected this to happen. Either way, they've always been riding down the cost curve. And I do think they're going to be coming out with vehicles that cost five to $7,000 less than their current vehicles, and that's aside from the robotaxi. And I don't think Tesla. Sorry, I'm moving from point to point here, so stop me at any point.
I'm following.
Okay,
I hope
so
everyone else is.
yeah, so the robotaxi, I don't know if they're gonna make, like, a version of that with a steering wheel. Either way, my view is that Tesla is no longer has 20 million vehicles by 2030 in their sights. I think they've gone, "Oh god, manufacturing is real hard. How about we just how about we focus on making really good vehicles really cheap, and then we make them autonomous, and we get most of our revenues that way." That way we can one vehicle gets leveraged into 5 from an environmental standpoint, because their motto is still accelerating the advent of sustainable energy. The fastest way to do that is to put a whole bunch of robotaxis on the road because that capital gets used much more intensively. They get used 5 times as much. So producing 1 million vehicles a year is effectively producing 5 million vehicles a year when it comes to the environment.
Very nice. Well, That robotaxi concept, I share your skepticism about whether it'll ever have a steering wheel or not. It's not looking like it at this stage, and that's okay because when you think of transportation as a business model, the best way to do that is to have one car that's on the road 24/7 or as close to 24/7 as you can get it. And yeah, if you're a car company, you like that too. Why? Because you're going to wear that thing out pretty quickly and want another one, and or replacement parts for it. And while they build fewer of them, especially if they can get a revenue stream out of the actual transportation aspect of it, then yeah, that'll change the whole dynamic and we'll continue down this path of saving the planet, but it'll be inadvertently through the reduction of the number of vehicles that we have to make, and that's all very cool. So, no politics intended with this. I'll paraphrase. I heard Sandy say, and that was that, okay, after November, it'll go back to the way it was. What does that mean? Well, right now everybody's posturing, and there's left and right and whatever that is. But after the election, we're past finally, it'll go back to business as usual. And I'll paraphrase him again. The politicians will go back from the pushback to where's my peace, and we'll be back to business as usual. So, and it wouldn't have mattered who won the election. That would have been the case, and that was Sandy's point of it. So we've seen a lot of stagnation in people trying to make investments and do whatever they think should come next. And now my hope is that we're past that. We're going to, finally get down to business and, continue to do what we were going to do.
Well, as an engineer, and my perspective as well, is you would just want things to work. You want them to be efficient. Let's focus on fixing problems.
There we go.
Yeah, we just want to be able to do our jobs.
Yeah, and I also want to believe also that if there is any change to the Inflation Reduction Act with regard to, the incentives that we're talking about, could they take some of the money that might have been allocated for that and apply it differently? Could we focus on safety of the vehicles? Right now, if you have an impediment to adoption in the market, there's way too many people that are afraid this thing's going to just explode while they're driving it down the road, however wildly unfounded that might be. Anybody who actually takes the time to read the statistics will find that these vehicles are far less fire prone than the combustion vehicles of yesteryear. But the old vehicles don't make the news nearly as much when they catch on fire, even if they burn at about 10 times the rate per mile driven. So if we could put a sort of modern day moonshot on making these things safe to the point where that impediment goes away, that'll probably be the single biggest thing that can be done to improve this market penetration and the electrification of our national and hopefully world fleet. So what are your thoughts on that? What else can we do to try to accelerate that process of adopting electrification in cars?
I think it's people's natural hesitancy towards a new technology. Something new is automatically scary, and as I think the best solution to do that um, is getting vehicles on the road. Like if you have an electric vehicle and you take it home, people start asking you questions about that, and it's real. It's right in front of them, and they see that you aren't scared of it. You can tell somebody the way something is, or you can live it, and it's a lot more persuasive when like if somebody tells you, "Oh, you should buy an electric vehicle because it charges fast enough for your daily needs and it's not going to catch on fire and things like that." But if they see you driving one and that you're actually living that, um, and they see it parking in your driveway every day, that familiarity gets them comfortable with it. So yeah, I think the primary way is just keep on selling the vehicles, get them on the road. It would also be helpful, I think, if there was an education campaign. Like I think companies like Tesla should be advertising to a certain extent. There's a lot of people that don't want EVs because of they have concerns about charging speed or safety. Um, what I can do on my part is I'm going to be releasing a video in the next month or two on vehicle fires. I dug into that and it's so interesting. Like, for instance, the total amount of heat released from an EV when it catches on fire is similar to the total amount of heat released with an ICE vehicle, an internal combustion vehicle. And in fact, the peak heat release rate for internal combustion vehicle is actually higher because all that fuel burns up so quickly. Whereas with batteries, they kind of spread from cell to cell, and it's kind of more of a graduated thing. Yes, it is more difficult to put it out, just because of the nature you have, just because of the nature of battery fires. But in terms of the threat to um, structures around the vehicle, it's roughly the same as an internal combustion vehicle, and it's much safer for passengers because it's legislated. It's part of the regulations that from as soon as one of those battery cells starts going into thermal runaway, the battery management system detects it. You get a warning on your dash, and you have 5 minutes to get out of that car before it catches on fire. With an internal combustion vehicle, whoop, you're just gone. There's no warning. There is no time. So that little bit of warning time that saves lives.
And that
Yeah.
warning time is creeping upwards. You know,
Oh, yeah. Well,
I've been looking at that. They've got technology,
exactly. 5 minutes is the minimum. A lot of these vehicles, it's an hour between the warning and when it catches on fire. An hour to get out of your vehicle.
which you hope you don't need. Yeah, so good. I'm really glad to hear that you're focusing on that. It's a subject near and dear to my heart. I've got quite a bit of my own background in that, if you will. So good. I'm looking forward to these things becoming more safe and, more importantly, for the public to perceive them as such. So yes, spread the word, show them the data. You know,
Yeah.
that's a huge contribution.
If people are afraid of something and it's new, it doesn't matter how safe you make it, until it becomes something that's familiar to them, they're going to have a bias against it. So the solution is to fix the fundamental underlying emotional aversion to them, rather than giving them data. The data helps. It helps push people over the edge, and it helps a certain group of people accept them. But yeah, it's really, funnily enough, it's um, familiarity changes people's perceptions. Like it's people, like for instance, if there's a dam and a river and there's people living downstream from it, the people who are the most carefree are usually the people living right next to the dam. And it's the people that, like, a few miles down the river that are the most anxious, and the anxiety drops off again at the furthest away from the dam. So yeah, humans are weird. So
Yes, we are. And I am that guy. Well, Jordan, we're about out of time here. Do you have any closing thoughts before we leave you to the rest of your day?
no, it's a great conversation. Every time I have a chat with you, I really enjoy it. So
Myself as well. It's
I have
always
to cut
wonderful.
my answers short because, like, yeah, you have a lot of thoughts and ideas about these things, and we can go down some real rabbit holes. But there's also you want to try to cover as many topics as you can to get that, just get some impressions for people, um, general views on things. So
Well, we
yeah.
covered quite a few today, so
Mm.
we did well not to dive too deep into those rabbit holes.
Mhm. Yeah.
All right. Thank you for keeping me in check. I'm the king of rabbit holes.
Hmm.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, everyone who's persevered through this whole thing. Jordan tends to talk pretty quickly. And, I found that just watching his videos, trying to speed up the speed is a little bit challenging because he's such a good talker and fast talker. Myself, not so much. So hopefully they found a speed that they could watch this video at that they found comfort in. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.